and gents, I'm Marc Daniel Nelson with Make Mine Music. Doing a mix this week for an artist named Zeev. The song is called Between. And it made me think about a couple things. How do you get massive low end? If I can't get low end thick and big and right, then it's not the right mix. It's not working for me. So I wanted to show you my favorite 4 plugins to get low end. I'm known for having a little bit over the top low end, to the point where I've always called mastering guys asking, should I trim my low end down a bit? And they always say, no, you're at this great point of danger and not. So I always thought of it as a guy on a tight wire, just barely keeping it together. And how much low end can you put into a mix? The kick drum, the bass, the synth, stuff like that. How much before it becomes too much? And I found that it's not necessarily the sub stuff. It's more the low mids that are making it sound too muddy or too boomy. So here are my 4. Number 1, Waves R-Bass. Now this was a plugin that I started using 15 years ago and probably used it wrong when I first started using it. Now I don't understand the philosophy behind it. I've talked to many people, including Waves, about what it actually is doing. I've been told many different things, from people saying that it's a harmonic generating sub-frequency booster. Some are saying that it's like a phantom frequency where you make it sound like you're hearing low end, but it's not necessarily boosting low frequencies. Regardless of what it's doing, it does help me, and it helps me in kick drum, it helps me in sub bass, it helps me in guitars, snares, toms, anything that I feel like was too thin and brittle. It just seemed to always add that body and that low end. What I have here is a drum set on this Zeev track that was played by the wonderful Aaron Sterling, phenomenal drummer here in LA. And I wanted a little more body on the snare, on the kick, and some of the toms and such. I want to show you the before and after of the kick and the snare. What I'm hearing is really good thick low end on the kick, a real fatness to the snare. I took them off the toms. I remember, I'm still in the middle of this mix, so I'm still kind of getting everything in place. But I remember going, that was too much because it's just too much low end. There's a lot of sub synthesizers in this. There's a real bass guitar. I feel like I needed to create some mid-range, but still had the sub stuff on the 4 on the floor. And let's hear what it sounds like with and without on the kick. Now without. Now it feels like the pocket is gone. That's with. Now let me pull up a little bit. It's subtle, but it's doing enough to go, okay, that's without. Very simple, very easy. Now let's listen to it on the snare as well, the same spot. I'll take it out, the snare, with the snare. So now listen to the low end, how it fattens it up. If you put the snare on a frequency chart, you probably see a little bit of boost bell around 110 to 200. That seems like that's like the really good sweet spot for a snare. But adding an EQ there seems to sometimes add a little too much woofiness to the mix. So by putting the R-Bass on the snare, it only adds that kind of roundness that you needed out of that specific frequency. So I'm hitting it at 119. I can pull it in and out, up and down, and you can hear what it's really adding. And that's pretty over the top. It doesn't sound bad without it, but what it's doing is adding this body to everything. I'm not using a tape saturator to add the low end on the drums, because what tape saturation does to drums, they cut off all the transient, they make it clean and fat, but they lose a little bit of that punch from kind of the rounding of the transient. By putting something like an R bass on the kick and snare and the toms, depending on the song, you kind of create a little more thickness and retain the sharpness of the transient. Let's hear the drum set all the way through with everything as I put it in and out. That's with the R bass on the kick and snare. And here's without. Back again. It really fattens it up in a very tasteful way. Let's go on. Number 2, Vitamin by Waves. I've had this plugin for a long time, but really didn't use it up until I was working on orchestra stuff because I needed some kind of character adjustment for doing molts on room mics for orchestras, and someone referred me to this plugin. And it made me start using it on other songs that ended up being one of my fastest go-to plugins I've had, specifically for low end and what it does. Now, what this guy does is it breaks it out into, seems like 5 different areas. The low, low lows, the low mids, the high mids, and high frequency. It has a spreading element as well, but what I really use this for is a couple reasons. One is to focus on the width of certain elements of the top band, and the other element, and what I'm going to talk to you today about, is the low band and the low mid band and how you can enhance certain things in a very clean way without having to add compression and EQ. And what it does is adds this little extra magic spark that you can get some serious mojo on your low end. I have it here on my master mix. I'm going to play the whole section of the track with everything open, and then I'm going to solo what actually it's doing so we can talk a little bit about it. We hear kick drum, we hear that snare, the fatness of the snare from the R bass. We hear sub synthesizer in there. We hear a guitar bass, and it seems to all sit pretty good for now. It's still in the middle. Like I said earlier, this is still in the middle of the mix, but I got it to a place where I felt like this is a good, comfortable way to demonstrate certain things. For this plugin, on the master, if I solo the low, low frequency, we're going to be able to hear the kick, we'll hear the bass guitar, we'll hear the synth bass, and we can decide what it's really doing, hear what it's really doing, know that it's crossing over at 78 before it hits the next band, and decide if we want to add some or take some away. And let's just hear what the band sounds like. You don't hear other elements other than what we just described. And what this is letting me do is also hear, okay, I have clean low end. It allows me to really hyper focus into that. Now, if I take it out, let's take it out completely. I'll bypass this low end thing and then I'll bring it in, and you can hear what it's really doing. That's without. I'm going to slowly bring it in. Too much. Then take it out again. It's really just rounding things off. It's cleaning everything correctly. It almost sounds like there's a completely new speaker when you add it. And that's what I feel like clean low end is really supposed to be there for. It's not necessarily how much woofiness you get out of your bass, but how much clean low end extension you can get out of it, where it almost feels like you just turned on another speaker just for that frequency. It doesn't add distortion. It doesn't really break up your speakers. It just seems to make things bigger and have more headroom. Number 3. The Ampeg B-15 by Universal Audio. This guy lets me add super amount of low end, almost to the point where it's just way too much. I seem to always have to carve a little bit out, but it does something so well on DI electric basses. I don't reamp the bass anymore specifically because of this plugin. I can show you in and out and show you exactly what it's doing. This Ampeg allows me to get a super clean, super authentic replication of the original B-15 that was one of my favorite bass amps growing into rock and roll. And it allows me to go between the two channels, the 66 and the 64. I like the 64 because it seems to be a little more fat, and the 66 seems to be a little more hi-fi. I guess that's the best word I can use for it. Without. Now that's just the DI. For this guy, I know that there were some notes that were a little bit over the top that I ended up just doing a multi-band on. I took some low end after 30 underneath so the synth bass could kind of stick out. And then I put a nice point around 1K that I usually do on the air EQ because that does seem to really have a great mid-range. Other than that, it's got a little bit of fur and a little bit of compression, and that's the sound. It really does work. If you take it out, it doesn't sound nearly as fat. There it is. It is not necessarily more about getting the low end as it's about getting the clean low end. And that's the hard thing with adding EQ to low end. You're getting all these added boominess. You use a tape saturator, it does fatten things up. You're losing transient and punch. On not everything, but specifically on drums, you definitely lose a little bit. And sometimes you call for that. But with our bass, the Vitamin plugin, the UA B-15 plugin, they all seem to add this really clean sub information that I can get, and then it just saves my tail every time. Even if I get a track that doesn't have great low end, you can pop on an R bass or a Vitamin and pull it out of it. It really comes out of it, same as the B-15. Number 4, the Haas Effect. This isn't necessarily a low-end effect as much as it's a delay effect, but I do want to use it on this top 4 plugins for low-end, blah, 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 because it helps make the low-end way more massive sounding. The Haas Effect goes way back. You take one mono signal and then you time shift it with a hard pan, hard right, and what it does is shift things enough where the center goes from mono to a stereo sounding image. It's certainly just a mono signal still because it's the same signal. It's just delayed just enough. And what I use it for in low end is when I use a bass guitar and a synth bass at the same time. And usually I choose one or the other for the center and the focus. And since this one has a really cool bass riff, I keep that in the center. And then the synth bass goes into the Haas Effect, which goes left and right. I have it here on my synth chorus lead. And if I take it in and out, they're on both of these guys. And you can see that I'm just doing a little bit of shift here and then a little bit of shift here. They're both different, and I'm using that just for a pan more than a delay. It's just creating a width thing. If I solo just the drums, bass, and the synth, you'll be able to hear what that's doing. I'm gonna take it out, listen to the synth bass. Fights, it narrows it. The low end is now all funky because you're getting the sub from the bass guitar and the synth bass, and they're fighting each other, trying to figure out what is what. By adjusting it 559 samples on one side and a little bit on the other, it's separating the direct signal just a little bit from the bass, and it's panning it hard left and right. It allows me to keep my low end of the synth bass And the focus. I know a lot of people teach that, you don't want to touch your stereo spreading of the low bass down after 100 hertz, but I feel like that is true. I feel like with this kind of song, you're getting all this excitement from left and right. And how to handle that is stereo spread and using that as your advantage to create separation and punch. So those are my 4 favorite low-end plugins. This isn't supposed to be any kind of like revelation of low end. All it's supposed to be doing is let you know that if it sounds good, it is good. Just enhance things just a little bit, just goose things just a little bit. And what you can do with the R-Bass, the Vitamin, the Ampeg, the Haas Effect, time delay, is just enhance low end. You start adding these things and it really, really does fatten up your mixes. Enjoy yourself. Thanks for watching, guys.